The story of Jewish prayer stretches back to the earliest moments of time. In essence, prayer is about a meeting of mind and heart in communion with God. But go into a shul or a synagogue today, and prayer can seem so formalized, right? Everyone's reading out of the same books, reciting the same words. I mean, where's the heart in that? What's the essence of Jewish prayer? And how did it become what it is today? And what steps can we take towards a more soul filled prayer experience? I'm Chaim Davies, and this is the Chaim Davies Show. Welcome back to the show. So, according to Jewish tradition, people have basically always been praying. But the ritual of tefillah, prayer, has developed substantially over the past 3,000 to 4,000 years. And in truth, it continues to do so even today. We need to look into the roots of prayer as found within the Torah and try to trace forward from there to uncover how we got here and how we can improve our current prayer situation. So, the concept of prayer as something Jews are called upon to engage in is actually presented within the Torah in the context of discussing the forbidden types of worship, avodah zarah, or idolatry. And this is where God, in chapter 24 of Exodus, is describing how when the Jewish people finally enter into the land of Israel, and God helps us conquer the resident powers there, we shouldn't be tempted to serve the false gods of those people, but rather, says the verse, Va'avadetem et Adonai Elohechem. You should serve only God himself. But the type of service in question is actually left undefined within the verse. And later on in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, Devarim, we find the famous words found within the second paragraph of the Shema of Le'ovdo b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshechem, that we're meant to serve God with all of our hearts and all of our souls. So we note that this service of God involves our hearts and our souls somehow, but what kind of service is it? So the oral tradition about this verse, as it's recorded in the beginning of Tractate Ta'anit, asks this question and tells us that this can only be a reference to tefillah. Ezo hi avodah shibalev, heve omer ze tefillah. So right off the bat, we learn that prayer is something done within the heart. It's primarily something which occurs within, rather than without, of the Jewish experience. There's an incredible amount that's been written about prayer, but probably the most heartfelt and impassioned writings are those of Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Cook, the first chief rabbi of pre-state Israel in the early 20th century. There's a story that I heard which really encapsulates the potency of Rav Cooks' approach to prayer. And this story was actually told to me by Rabbi Elisha Paul, the one who the story actually happened with. And Rabbi Paul at the time was a young student at Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, studying under the giant of the previous generation, Rabbi Shmuel Yaakov Weinberg of blessed memory. And he came across Rav Cooks' commentary on the Siddur, which he found to be really beautiful. So he decided to approach his brilliant Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Weinberg, and ask him his opinion about what he thought about the commentary. So he comes to him and approaches him with that reverence that a young student has for his sagely teacher. And he asks him what he thinks of it. Says Rabbi Weinberg, Rav Cook didn't write a commentary on the Siddur. So Rabbi Paul thought maybe his Rosh Hashiva was a little bit confused. Perhaps the Rosh Hashiva isn't familiar with the writings of Rav Cook, he asks, almost embarrassed to ask a question like that. I told you, Rav Cook did not write a commentary to the Siddur, says Rabbi Weinberg. Now Rabbi Paul is getting a little bit confused himself. Maybe he's confused about who wrote the book. But then Rav Yaakov Weinberg explained. He said, Rav Cook didn't write a commentary to the Siddur. He spilled his neshama onto paper. He simply poured his soul out onto the parchment in front of him. Wow. So this is the type of person that Rav Cook was, and the type of commentary he wrote, if we can even call it that, to understanding what the Siddur is. And so in his introductory essay to the Siddur, Rav Cook explains something both elementary and beautiful about prayer. He says what you have to know is that the soul is constantly in a state of tefillah. The human soul is always praying, and it is constantly yearning to express that tefillah. And the institutions of tefillah within Torah are simply to allow a portal for that inner prayer to burst forth onto the surface by joining our mind and our heart in actualizing those stirrings of the soul. Now, again, this is an astoundingly profound commentary. This is just the first few sentences, and we obviously can't mine all of its depths here. But we need to understand this inner yearning of prayer that Rav Cook is writing about. What happens in tefillah, and how can we deepen our own experience of when we're standing in prayer? So the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, enumerates prayer as one of the 613 mitzvot, the actionable instructions of Torah, which is actually pretty surprising when you think about it. I mean, commanding us to ask of things from God, what purpose could that serve? But as we'll see, tefillah is about much more than simply dropping God a line when we're in need. We're going to find this curious and fascinating relationship in tefillah between hearts and minds, which is really thematic to so much of the Jewish experience. Let's start with the word for prayer in Hebrew itself, tefillah. What does that word actually mean? So the root letters of the Hebrew word tefillah are peh, lamed, lamed, palel. The second lamed of the root is actually dropped and replaced with a dagesh, a stress point in the first lamed. That's why the word tefillah is spelled with just one lamed instead of two. But be that as it may, what does the root word palel mean? So, one of the most beautiful aspects of the language of Torah is the way in which words almost innocently cross-define one another. By finding the root of a word used in one instance, you can immediately come to identify the essence of its meaning in another. And tefillah is a great example of this phenomena. So the first time the word tefillah appears in the Torah is as an active verb, and it's not used to mean prayer. We're reading this story about how Jacob, is reunited with his son Yosef after the many painful years they spend apart. And Yaakov is reflecting on the time that they spent away from each other and how he had all but completely separated himself from the notion that Yosef would ever be found again, and that now he has this opportunity not only to see his son Yosef, but to see his grandchildren as well. And the way Yaakov proclaims this is where we need to look more closely. He says to Yosef, Re'o panecha lo pilalti. I never thought, pilalti, that I would ever see your face again. And yet here I am seeing you along with your children. So the word means to think. And if that wasn't clear enough, the great medieval commentator Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, jumps in to stress that plila lashon machshava, that the word palel is a term meaning contemplation. So amazingly, the very word tefillah means thought or mindfulness. And as we'll see, the fulfillment of this mitzvah is actually predicated upon one's ability to achieve the particular state of consciousness that is defined as tefillah. Now, of course, not all states of mindfulness constitute tefillah. And the focus part is just the beginning of the experience. I mean, obviously something has to happen within that state of mind. But first we need to discover what kind of focused contemplation is this tefillah. And then we can look into the specifics of how a person should conduct themselves within that space. So in the fourth chapter of Hilchot Tefillah, the laws of prayer, the Rambam arrives at the subject of what's called ma'akveh tefillah, things which withhold or prevent tefillah from occurring, things which hinder the prayer experience. And while that whole list is really the subject of an entire chapter of specifics over there, the one which jumps off the page for our purposes is the last one on the list, called kavanat halev, or direction of the heart. Direction of the heart. The word for direction, kavanah, refers to a person's orientation or a point of reference. What are you focused towards? Where's your mind aimed at? It implies intention, attentiveness, a targeted aim. And from which point of departure? From the heart. A person must direct their heart in a particular direction. So the immediate question becomes, directed where? So towards the end of that chapter in the laws of tefillah, the Rambam arrives at his explanation of kavanat halev. And he writes that direction of the heart is one of those make it or break it components of tefillah. Without this direction, not only is a person not praying at all, but they aren't even allowed to pray. This isn't just some lofty aspiration where a person speaks to God every day and hopes that eventually they'll get better at concentrating. Says the Rambam, without kavanah, you aren't davening. And this isn't the Rambam's own novel ruling. He's quoting directly from the Talmud in Tractate Eruvin, page 65a, where the Talmud itself teaches that anyone whose mind is unsettled, can't maintain a clear focus, should not pray. The Talmud even says that there were scholars like the father of Shmuel who would return home from an arduous and difficult journey and wouldn't pray for a whole 3 days until their minds would settle and they could finally achieve the appropriate focus. Now, don't worry, we'll come around to discuss what people do nowadays. Here, what we're looking at so far is the normative and codified legal definitions of the basic ingredients of tefillah. And we're finding that without kavanat halev, without direction of the heart, Tefillah is not possible. So the Rambam goes on to define his terms for us. And he writes as follows. Ketzad hi hakavana. What is this direction we're supposed to have? It is sheyifneh libo mikol hamachshavot, that one clears their heart of all thoughts. No lingering interests or deliberations can remain. And then comes a new perspective. V'yireh atzmo ki'ilu hu omed lifnei hashchina. He must see himself as if he's standing in the presence of the Shekhinah. You must begin to see yourself in this completely new way. Become reoriented to your new surroundings. You're not standing behind some other Jew praying in the back of the shul. You're standing in the presence of the Shekhinah. Now, there's plenty of names and titles that the Torah uses for God, and each name implies some other type of relationship that we share with God, another way that God becomes known to us, right, within our world, within our experience. The word Shekhinah itself translates as indwelling or a presence. But what does that term Shekhinah mean when it's applied to God? So without diving too deeply into the sources here, and I would just refer anyone who is interested to reading Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher's introduction to Parshat Nitzavim. But it's clear from really across rabbinic literature that the primary connotation of the name Shekhinah is love. It's a name of God which implies an intimate, loving presence. It's this palpable indwelling of that powerful force of love which is so definitive of God's act of creation itself. And so if kavanah is about seeing ourselves in the presence of the Shekhinah, then what we're being called upon to do is to sense that we are standing in the presence of a loving relationship between God and Israel. We need to get ourselves into that mind space if we're going to communicate with God. And that isn't a quick change of orientation. I mean, for one, you can't just start thinking about it. As the Rambam said, Yifneh libo mikol machshavot. You have to clear your mind first. Communion with God isn't just another task on our checklist that we can multitask through. It requires complete, unadulterated focus. In fact, the Talmud tells us that the early pious scholars would spend an entire hour meditating and clearing their minds of all their worldly affairs, and would only then inject the thought of God's love into their consciousness. You can't just dash into the synagogue, do your quick 3 steps back, 3 steps forward, and dip into this diving bow as you flip open the siddur to davening. Tefillah requires preparation. You know, I once met somebody who had this little sticky note that he would keep at the back of his siddur, and when his mind would stray during his davening, he would flip to the back of the book and gaze at this little reminder, and then he would jump back into the middle of his prayers. So one time I saw his siddur sitting there on the table, so naturally I flipped it open to the back cover, see what he had written back there. And what it said was the following. It said, on this little piece of paper, it said, God loves you and he can't wait to hear your voice. That's kavanah. That's prayer. Knowing that it's all about accessing that space, creating that love, standing in the presence mindfully, knowingly that God loves you, and all he's waiting for is to hear your voice, for you to share your thoughts, your inner feelings, that inner voice of the soul that is desperate to break forth, to share its light, to express its love, to express all of the inner feelings that it has. That's standing in the presence of the Shekhinah. So says the Rambam, a person who creates that kind of space for tefillah can't at the same time relate to prayer as a burden. I mean, you can't view prayer as another item on your checklist, something to get past or get done with before carrying on with your day. And actually, the Rambam says you have to literally resist finishing with your prayer before moving on to the rest of your daily activities. So he says that a person is required to actually sit for a little bit after he finishes praying before moving on in your day to express in action the fact that you don't want to leave. And so this direction of the heart, this understanding that you're standing in the presence of a loving relationship between God and Israel, that you are the embodiment of that presence, is the essential component of prayer. And so a lot of people actually wonder about this, and it's really a worthwhile loose end to wrap up here, that why isn't this concept stressed so much nowadays as we'd expect that it should? I mean, yeah, most of us hear about the concept of kavanah. It's important to have focus and direction in your thoughts, but we're not always told how critical it is to the tefillah experience or how nuanced it is either. And I think the reason for this can largely be traced back to a novel ruling of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, the Maharam, a 13th century scholar of France, which made its way into the right halachic works and ultimately became enshrined into law. So what the Maharam recognized in his era was that if people would continue on with the practice of only praying when they had achieved this ideal state of mindfulness, the rates of prayer would continue diminishing to the point that the vast majority of people wouldn't even know what prayer is or how to actually engage in prayer on the rare occasion that they got the mindset right. I mean, if we don't give people a chance to try, they'll never make it. So Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg wrote that nowadays, we aren't so cautious about praying with the perfected mindset. Let's let people pray in whatever way they can try to. And hopefully that way, they'll slowly develop and arrive at a place in which they can actually achieve the proper kavanah. So the Maharam wasn't redefining tefillah. He wasn't trying to set the bar lower for us today. The heart of tefillah has never changed. For us to be truly mitpalel, to pray, we must still center our minds and hearts around this indwelling of God's loving presence within our midst. And this is where these aspects of mind and heart really merge together into creating a single unit. I mean, if we're supposed to be connecting with God in this emotive way, as we've described, then why does consciousness specifically need to play such a central role? So the Rambam really reveals the secret to this in a short footnote he writes in his philosophical masterpiece, The Guide for the Perplexed, or Moreh Nevuchim. And this is in the third section over there at the end of chapter 51. And there he writes something which really lies at the basis of so much of Torah's underlying objectives. He says that the mind, which God has endowed us with, is the link that joins us to God, our mind, and that the choice is ours. If we wish to strengthen that bond, that endowment of our unique consciousness, we may do so. And if we choose to weaken it gradually until it breaks, we're able to do that as well. So the choice is given over to us. The glue between us and our Maker is our consciousness. When we utilize it appropriately, we fortify that bond. And when we act on impulse and abandon ourselves to our drives, we weaken that connection. So how does a person strengthen that bond? Explains the Rambam. This bond is strengthened rak b'hishtamshecha bo be'avat Eloha v'shetiyeh kavanatcha eleha. Only when you use it in the love of God and in directing yourself, kavanah, towards that love. So it emerges that tefillah is not only a means to having our requests answered, but it's actually an exercise in strengthening the bond between us and our Maker. Our consciousness, our uniquely individual sense of being me and having a sense of self which I can articulate in a way that only I can, is that precious overlap between a creation and her creator. Only as we utilize our hearts and our minds in the service of God do we strengthen the cords of love connecting us back to our source. Now, as beautiful as this is, in practice, it's actually quite difficult for most of us to know what we're supposed to do in order to make this a reality. And even if we could use our mindfulness apps and get into the zone, with our Zen meditation, what would we actually say to God? I mean, sure, we've all got things to ask for, but is that all we're supposed to do? And how did this meditative experience of tefillah, expressing the inner soul's yearning for connection, how did that become a standardized script of 100 pages every morning? For these questions, we'll have to leave you on a bit of a cliffhanger until next episode. But until then, I'm Chaim Davies, and this is the Chaim Davies Show. See you soon. I hope you enjoyed that segment of the Chaim Davies Show. If you did, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell or follow our podcast so you can stay up to date on all our future content.